We ready?
Yes, I'm going to start in about 10 seconds.
Okay.
Welcome to today's Zoom news conference, co-sponsored by the California Commission on Redistricting. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services, and a special thanks to all of you for joining us during this busy holiday week. After months of intense activity, California's 14-member Citizen Redistricting Commission has finalized the new political maps that will dictate representation in California at the state and federal level for the next decade. Our speakers today will report on how the maps will impact historically underrepresented communities of color in the state and how California's redistricting process compares to the fight for fair maps going on in other states. We're honored to have Redistricting Commissioner Russell Yee, a lecturer in theology and an author from the East Bay, share his perspective, together with three speakers whose organizations have been at the forefront of redistricting reform for 2 decades. Thomas Saenz, Executive Director of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF, Jonathan Mehta-Stein, Executive Director of California Common Cause, and Paul Mitchell, owner of Redistricting Partners and Vice President of Political Data, Inc. Our moderator today is veteran journalist and author Pilar Marrero. We ask our speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters in Mandarin, Korean, and Spanish, and our reporters to enter your questions in the chat box. We will send a video of today's conference and an extended bio and photographs of our speakers to everyone this afternoon. And now I turn the conference over to my colleague, Pilar Marrero.
Thank you, Sandy. Happy holidays, everyone. Thanks for working today. Just a small correction. Thomas Saenz is President and General Counsel of MALDEF.
Thank you.
All right, let's begin. We begin by welcoming back Paul Mitchell, who will give us his overview of the redistricting process. The goals were to be transparent, increase citizen participation, reduce gerrymandering, and equal the playing field for the many diverse populations who now form a majority of minorities in the state. Paul, how did California do?
Well, California did great, I think. And I just want to say I'm honored to be here with two of the icons in redistricting around the country, Tom Saenz and Jonathan Stein, both extraordinary people to be involved and real thought leaders in this process going forward. And also a great commissioner, Russell Yee. He was, from a redistricting perspective, from like a person who does redistricting, he was very deft at being able to like understand how things moved and understand the redistricting process. So a great commissioner, and great to be here with you and with them. Just for background, we did a presentation back in October, and so I'm going to go through a little PowerPoint that kind of goes through the same basics we went through last time, but now we have the lens of looking at it kind of looking backwards. Whereas when we were doing it last time, they hadn't actually started, drawing final lines and confronting all the challenges that they had to confront in this process. By way of background, our firm, Redistricting Partners, does work on the outside of redistricting commissions. So like in around the country in different states or in California, helping advise groups that are seeking to understand or take part in the redistricting that's being done by commissions. And then in many, many other instances, we're actually the ones working for the commission. So we're the demographer for the commission in the state of New York, and for more than 90 different local governments around the state and around the country. So our perspective is a little bit unique but I'm happy to chat with you about kind of what we see and what kind of the good and the bad of what's been happening with redistricting here in California and around the country. So first off, the redistricting process in California was shaped by state propositions 11 and 20. This was a process created in order to ensure that we would get high quality, competent commissioners, but also commissioners that weren't being kind of put in place in order to try to advance a political party or an incumbent or some kind of group objective. They were selected through this 2-year process of application and vetting and legislative strikes, even to the point where at one point they pulled in the little ping pong ball machine from the state lottery to actually select out numbers and award seats on the commission. It's not partisan, but it does have a kind of a slant towards voting rights and protecting communities of interest. And so they do have almost a kind of core set of beliefs that I think we got to see a lot of during the commission process. But it's not like red-blue partisan in its nature. The process when we did this presentation last time was that kind of redistricting Roomba, where they were wandering around the state trying to put together different areas. But as we got through the process, they started actually converting those into actual districts. The challenges the commission faced start with the population changes. So when we think about redistricting, we're doing it to balance population, so every district has equal number of people, and also to deal with changing demographics. And so it's not as simple as just like plugging all this stuff into a computer. It really does require a lot of understanding of trade-offs and exploring those. The state had areas where there were lower or higher rates of population growth, and that made a big impact on where we were going to be looking at major changes. The largest kind of challenge was in the LA area, where there was a 2% population growth, but statewide it was 6%. And so in a huge area like LA, they were effectively short hundreds of thousands of residents to fill in the existing districts. And so a lot of change had to happen. 10 years ago, there were additional Voting Rights Act requirements under Section 5 of the Federal Voting Rights Act that were operative. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is still there, but it's not enforceable anymore. And so the removal of those requirements is something this commission has different in its toolkit than what was available to them in 2011. There was increased population growth among Latinos and Asians, Latinos statewide and Asians most specifically in heavily Asian communities. And the Black population grew, but also dispersed a lot. So we saw lower density of Black population in certain communities in LA and in the East Bay in Northern California. And that has challenges for the commission process. One thing that became apparent through the process was that we had these increasing populations of minorities and minority communities in California. And a lot of the advocacy groups and the commissioners themselves spoke about the fact that they wanted to make sure that as districts were implemented, they were not dealing with this growth of minority population by reducing the number of minority seats. In fact, in the redistricting process, we saw a real expansion of the number of districts that are majority minority in the state. When we look nationally at redistricting, we see a very different picture. Nationally, redistricting is much more of a partisan game with, Democrats and Republicans in different states having the advantages and drawing districts with those kind of things in mind. There are more commissions. Maybe Michigan's is the most akin to California's, but they have varying structures. They will likely impact the quality of lines being drawn, but not to the extent that we see in California. It's not like we have 50 California commissions. We only have one that is truly the California model. And so looking around the country, we're not seeing the same kind of results in other states that we see in California. There will be a number of states that really determine the battlegrounds in Congress. And there's also strong likelihood of a number of lawsuits around the country that will help shape what are the ultimate lines for the 2022 election and going forward. We have state redistricting, we have the national perspective, but we also can't forget about what's happening locally. The state implemented new policies under the State's Fair Maps Act that change redistricting at the local level. The Fair Maps Act imposes kind of a structure and criteria that pulls from some of the elements of the State Redistricting Commission's process. The most important or critical ones of those is that it disallows the use of incumbents or political parties in the creation of lines. The criteria are ranked, and the only place where it actually mentions anything about incumbents is to say that incumbents cannot be used as a community of interest. And we're seeing the results of those first redistrictings under counties and a number of cities that have primaries right now. And while we're not seeing perfection, we are seeing areas where there's still, I think, serious concerns about the outcomes of the redistricting process. We are, I think, as a state, benefiting from a lot more transparency, a lot more public engagement, a lot more tools and ways in which the public can involve themselves in the local redistricting. And we hope that it's making for better lines ultimately. The other agencies in the state, whether it's a community college or a school board or a water district or the, sanitation district or whatever it is in your area, they are also likely having to do redistricting if they have districts. And those rules for those agencies hasn't changed as much as it has for cities and counties in the state, but we're seeing kind of a trickle down of some of those best practices. So we'll be doing a water board redistricting and they'll say, hey, can we get a public mapping tool? And can we make sure that our maps are public for 7 days before we discuss them? And can we have 2 outreach hearings and like doing things that are trying to, achieve that higher kind of quality redistricting? That's beneficial, I think, to everyone. Our company is doing a number of these redistrictings around the state. We concluded the Long Beach Independent Redistricting Commission. We advised the commission in Los Angeles, which finished with the final report, prominently featuring our other speaker, Jonathan Stein, discussing additional reforms they need in Los Angeles. But overall, we're working with more than 90 agencies. The commission process is working in other jurisdictions. LA County just completed theirs. There are a number of other local governments that are completing theirs right now, or some will be going until about April to finish theirs. We believe that commissions are more responsive to voices in the community than when an agency redistricts themselves. They are more responsive to concerns about access to public engagement, language issues, and those community-based organizations and the input from community-based organizations. More commonly, a commission will say, adopt a unity map or put out a final plan that utilizes elements from organizational unity mapping projects than like a city council just doing the redistricting on their own. So some benefits, areas maybe where things can be improved, but definitely some benefits. Minority voting rights have definitely been strengthened in the redistricting process. Just in the congressional redistricting as an example, according to MALDEF's calculations and working with them, there were 10 majority minority Latino districts in the state prior to the redistricting process. There were 16 that were over 50% of citizen voting age population Latino at the end. So effectively a 60% growth in those. The commission highlighted 14 of those that were drawn based on Section 2 Voting Rights Act considerations. So slightly different depending on how you calculate it, but ultimately a redistricting that did represent the strength and growth of the Latino Asian populations. There were 3 congressional districts as an example that were drawn with more than a third of the population being Asian, in a way to try to impact their ability to elect a candidate of choice. And then the commission also sought to ensure that areas with more dense Black population would allow for that African-American candidate of choice to have a better outcome in coming elections. So a lot of focus on the minority voting rights in this redistricting process, and I think ultimately very positive outcomes. In some areas, there aren't necessarily Voting Rights Act requirements, but there can be communities of interest that have ethnic, language, national origin elements to them. And the commission was very focused on ensuring that they got testimony from those kinds of groups and that they sought to utilize those communities of interest when they drew lines. So even if it wasn't a community that could rise to being 50% of a district, these communities were kind of critical building blocks of districts as the commission went about their work. And we see that also in local redistricting. Communities of interest is something that is great about the current way we draw districts in California around the country. It emphasizes drawing districts around groups that need to have their voting and representation power enforced. Communities of interest can become kind of a boogeyman sometimes too to groups who want to kind of tear down the redistricting process. You get a lot of this kind of anti-intellectual stuff about, oh, what is a community of interest? But really, communities of interest are well defined in the law. And there are elements that are subjective, but the idea with communities of interest is, where is an area, say of the state or of a city or an area within a school district boundary, where you have individuals, residents that have a shared characteristic, can be physically or geographically located where they live in order to draw them into a district, and also have some like connection to the state policy making that is happening. The one great definition I heard was that communities of interest are groups that are being harmed by their government. And that's a little bit of a pessimistic view maybe, or a way of defining it. But essentially what it means is, if you have a community that when it's split up by redistricting, it doesn't have the power to get their issues addressed, whether it's they're in the hillsides, or they're a downtown renter community, or they're the LGBT community, or they're a community that has been trying to get better access to transportation. If there are those kinds of groups around the state or around a local redistricting, and they are harmed by the policies that their government makes, and they can be put into a district where they can stand up and have better access to representation, have better voting power in a new set of lines, then the agency should be trying to draw those into their own districts to strengthen their voting power and allow them to essentially fight back and allow them to have a voice in their politics that might not be afforded to them if they were split into multiple districts, where now, they're 8% of 5 different districts and no elected official really has to worry much about them. Where if they were 30% of one district, then elected officials would really have to be more responsive.
Paul,
Yeah.
Are you done?
I've got one last slide,
up?
and this is the last slide I want to touch on is gerrymandering or gerrymandering. People think that gerrymandering is just one thing sometimes. They say, oh, gerrymandering is when Democrats and Republicans fight. And that is one type of gerrymandering. The courts at the federal level have decided not to really adjudicate that. There's also racial gerrymandering, where you're either trying to split up a racial community into multiple districts to weaken their voting power, or you're trying to shove them all into one district to say, like, you get this one token district, but you're not going to be able to affect other elections. There's also incumbent gerrymandering, where you're drawing districts and then you have this one little arm that goes out and grabs the house of an incumbent, essentially putting the needs of incumbents before the needs of residents. And there's another kind that I think we've seen a lot in the redistricting, which is amenity gerrymandering. It's basically drawing into a district, like where the big political donors are, or where the marquee kind of location is in a district, in order to try to give to elected officials kind of these gifts in redistricting. We definitely didn't see that in the state redistricting, but we do see it a lot in local redistricting, where you have essentially gerrymandering coming down to kind of giving out the redistricting of things, as opposed to making districts that are reflective of those communities.
Okay,
So
so we're
with
going
that, I'll go ahead and stop that.
Yeah, we're going to leave questions till the end so we can have everyone offer their statements, and then we can ask questions of it from everyone. Thank you so much, Paul. Our next speaker is Commissioner and Vice Chair of the Commission, Russell Yee, one of 5 Republicans who joined 5 Democrats and 4 independents on the commission. Mr. Yee, we're so pleased to have you and have your perspective. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. An honor to be here and an honor to be on the commission. You know, ironically, I might be the least political person on this call. I was very apolitical most of my life, and it was really only in recent years and seeing the erosion of democracy in America that motivated me to want to do something. And the commission was perfect because it was a way of being on everyone's side. You know, being on the commission means I can go up to any one of almost 40 million Californians and say, I'm on your side, and it would be the truth. And I wanted to do something where that would be the case. So great honor to be here. And we're in the afterglow of yesterday delivering our final report and final maps to the Secretary of State. And so happy that that final report and final maps were approved by unanimous vote of the commission, all 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 no party affiliation. By the way, that last category has to be neither of the first 2 largest party affiliations in California. They could have well been third party, but as it happened, all 4 in our commission were no party affiliation.
Commissioner, remember to speak slowly for the
Yes,
interpreters.
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So happy for the unanimous vote, and so happy that all of us really felt good about the maps in the end. You know, the 2010 commission, the big challenge was, you know, inventing it all from scratch, and something had never been done before. And here it's crazy to think that a commission of lay people is going to redistrict the largest state with the most complex geography and demography in the nation by far. You know, it's really a dubious proposition, but they succeeded under an incredibly tight deadline. Our challenges were different. We had the pandemic, you know, and the census delays. And so even though we had more than twice the time, I think we had more than twice the uncertainty to navigate along the way. And then at the end, the court mandated deadline of December 27th, which was earlier than we wanted. And, you know, put the heaviest work right during the holidays. Nevertheless, we were able to complete the maps. So super happy that we all felt good about the maps and how it all turned out. As Paul mentioned, a lot of expansion of minority voting districts. As he mentioned, 14 VRA districts in Congress, 9 in the Senate, 19 in the Assembly, and all quite a bit more than in the 2010 maps. Well, why is that? You know, I wish I could say it was altruism or activism. It was actually really because we wanted our maps to endure. You know, if you don't draw enough VRA districts, then somebody challenges you in court and your maps get thrown out, and the whole thing gets thrown out, not just one district that's under question. Contrariwise, if you try to draw too many, they can be challenged as well, or you can find that you drew districts that actually don't perform, as the lingo puts it. So for instance, there was a debate about the Central Valley congressional districts, whether to draw 3 Latino VRA districts or 4. And there was a lot of debate over that. In the end, the commission took what you can say is the more conservative route. We drew 3. We wanted them to be strong districts that would perform. In other words, that the Latino majorities in those districts would be able to elect the candidates of their choice of any race. Rather than drawing 4 less strong Latino majority districts, that might lead to perhaps only 2 being able to elect candidate of choice, or maybe even 1, you know, which would kind of miss the whole point of the project. So, so those are some of the choices we faced and landed on the districts we did. I will say the credit for just the consistent support on the commission for minority voting rights. I'll credit, actually, I'm going to credit Cathay Feng, who was the original architect from Common Cause, Jonathan's colleague, original architect of the propositions that created the commission. And part of the original architecture is the selection criteria for commissioners. And one of the key criterion is an appreciation for California's diversity. And so all of us were really examined for that. And could we show evidence from our life and our work that we had an appreciation for California's diversity? That's easy for me growing up in Oakland. But my family's been here 100 years. So, but all the commissioners, we're for voting rights. We're for minority voting rights. And most of the time, I would say, if you watched our discussions, and of course they were all public, I would like to bet you could not tell who was which party, 95+% of the time. In fact, one of our consultants told me he actually looked up the party affiliation somewhat later in the process, and he was just surprised and shocked because he had guessed completely wrong on most of us. So, so the selection of us, the fact that we all wanted the same thing in the end, fair and equitable maps, and maps that would endure, And so we paid very close attention to our legal counsel. We didn't just take everything they said. We challenged them many times and a lot of back and forth. But in the end, our interest was maps that would last. So even though, one could say that certainly there was a lot of advancement in terms of VRA districts and majority minority districts, a lot of that was simply us trying to make good maps. It wasn't for any particular partisan or activist interest. And trying to reflect a California that is increasingly populated by minorities, racial minorities. Of course, outside of VRA concerns, we're actually not allowed to consider race as a predominating consideration in redistricting. That goes back to the Shaw decision of the Supreme Court and that whole line of decisions. It can be one consideration, but not a predominating consideration. Also, for those who may not be as familiar with the VRA, it's not a matter of drawing a majority minority district wherever you can. You have to not only have a large majority minority population, which is really hard, enough to make more than half of a voting district, which is really hard because in California, the voting districts are kind of ridiculously large. For the Senate, it's over 1 million, which is crazy.
Lower, please.
Yes.
And yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. But you have to also show that that minority population votes cohesively. And that's where you get what's called racially polarized voting analysis. And so you may have a large minority population, but they may not all vote the same way, in which case they're not being prevented necessarily from electing a candidate of their choice. And then you also have to show that the adjacent white population votes differently. In other words, that there is racially polarized voting. And one thing we learned is that California is actually, there's some nice trends of what's called crossover voting. That is, most of the time, that's white voters voting alongside for the same candidates as the preferred candidate of minority voters. And so you may well have a large minority population and an adjacent white population actually voting together. In other words, the voting is not racially polarized. And so in a case like that, in a region like that, you would not qualify for a VRA district. And so that's actually the promise of the VRA being fulfilled here in California, and very heartening to see that.
Commissioner, can we wrap up so we can go to our third?
Sure.
Thank you.
That's about it. Yeah. We're also very proud that it was just the most participatory, open access redistricting effort in the nation, and probably in all history. We pioneered some new online tools where you could actually draw us a map, draw us a district, draw us your community of interest, and submit a map directly to us. We translated all our materials, all our key materials, into 13 different languages, had live translation available in many meetings, and just very proud of all the efforts we made to make this the most accessible, the most participatory redistricting effort in the nation. Even though one would say California, it's the hardest one. It's the hardest state for such an effort. With everyone's support, the state and the state's faith in us, we were able to do it.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. We appreciate you being with us. Let's move on to our third speaker, Thomas A. Sáenz, President and General Counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF. Go ahead, Tom.
Thanks, Pilar. So on behalf of MALDEF, I have to say that the Commission did a terrific job in complying with the Voting Rights Act in drawing maps for the state of California, as Commissioner Yee just explained. Not a perfect job. We think they could have made a few tweaks to make it perfect, but as good as you can expect, and that's all to the good, particularly as we see line drawers in other states across the country from both parties, and I'll more on that in a minute, that are not complying with the Voting Rights Act, indeed seem to be deliberately failing to comply with the Voting Rights Act. The result, of course, in the state of California is a dramatic increase in the number of Latino CVAP majority districts. As Paul explained, CVAP is citizen voting age population. That's what we use as a proxy for eligible voters. And a majority minority district means that that minority group should have the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice. And as Commissioner Yee also mentioned, that does not mean candidates from the same racial minority group. In California, we historically have had and probably will have in the future Latino majority districts that in fact elect Black candidates to office and white candidates to office and eventually probably Asian American candidates to office. So it's not the race of the candidates that matters, it's the race of the voters, and making sure that voters who have faced racially polarized voting and other forms of voting discrimination in the past have the opportunity to elect candidates that they support, regardless of the race of those candidates that they support. But we have seen significant increases in the number of Latino CVAP majority districts in all three plans. So Congress went from 10 to 16. The state assembly went from 17 to 22. The state senate went from 7 to 10. So significant increases in each of the maps. You'll note that the numbers I gave you are slightly higher than the VRA defined districts that both Paul and—
Can you slow down a bit?
Sure. That both Paul and the commissioner identified. The reason is that the size of the Latino population is such in the state of California today that there are areas you have to draw Latino majority districts. You really don't have a choice because of the nature of the population in those areas. So they would be majority Latino districts regardless of any application of the Voting Rights Act. But those significant increases in Latino majority districts should be no surprise, because in fact, the Latino community, despite a significant undercount, we are now becoming aware in the 2020 census, the Latino community grew substantially, particularly in relation to other communities in California. Latinos accounted for 69% of the total population growth of the state of California in the last decade, and even more, 70% of the growth in citizen voting age population, again, a proxy for eligible voters in the state of California. So with well over 2/3 in both those categories, you would expect to see increases, as we have seen, in Latino majority districts. Importantly, this creates opportunities that didn't exist previously for areas of the state to elect candidates from the Latino community, supported by the Latino community. In particular, we see opportunities in the San Joaquin Valley, in the Antelope Valley portion of Los Angeles County, and in the Central Coast. So those are opportunities that we'll see how they play out over the next decade. There is still a tremendous power of being an incumbent. So initially, we may see incumbents getting reelected, even if they don't have the levels of support of the Latino community in those Latino majority districts that we might otherwise see. Again, this is entirely a result of the relative growth of the Latino population. Another measure of that is the Latino population in California grew by 11.2% in the last decade. The non-Latino population, all others in the state of California, only grew by 3.1% in the last decade. This is, as the commissioner has explained, also mandated by the Voting Rights Act. In the absence of Section 5 that Paul explained used to apply to portions of the state of California, there are really only three major national federal constraints on redistricting. They are, first of all, you have to redistrict to get your populations relatively equal. That's under the one person, one vote principle of the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution. That's why we go through redistricting, to get our districts back closer to equality, near perfect equality when it comes to congressional districts, a little more leeway on the Assembly and the Senate. Second, racial gerrymandering, as Commissioner Yee has explained, race may not be a predominant consideration in drawing lines, except where the Voting Rights Act, compliance with the Voting Rights Act requires it. So apart from the Voting Rights Act, you cannot make race the predominant overriding consideration in drawing lines. And finally, of course, the Voting Rights Act itself, which, as you've heard, where there is a pattern of racially polarized voting, a minority community votes differently, generally from voters from other communities, and you can draw a majority minority district. You have an obligation, looking at other circumstances as well, but you have an obligation then to draw majority minority districts. And that's what we've seen play out here. Basically two things: dramatic growth, particularly relative to other populations of the Latino community in California. And number two, the Voting Rights Act mandate that you create majority minority districts where there is racially polarized voting, and you have the ability to draw compact districts that are majority minority. Again, bottom line is opportunities for the Latino community voters, which are now 27% of registered voters in California, to elect candidates of their choice to more congressional seats. And that's despite the loss of one congressional seat to the state as a whole, in more assembly seats and in more state Senate seats. So in the end, MALDEF and our team of advocates led by Stephen Ochoa, our national redistricting coordinator, very pleased with the outcome from the commission. And we look forward to the outcomes of the elections that will come under these new district lines beginning next year. Thanks, Yolanda.
Thank you, Tom. This is the most pleased I've ever seen you of all the years I've known you. So that's a good thing. Our final.
Based in California, but.
Yeah, I know. There's still a lot to complain about around the country. Okay, our final speaker is Jonathan Mehta Stein, Executive Director of Common Cause California, which also has been at the forefront of redistricting reform, both in our state and nationwide. Jonathan, what are the lessons learned from this year's redistricting, or is it too soon to tell?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for the opportunity to join this panel. To answer that question, I want to go backwards just a bit and talk about California's redistricting in the past and share just a very quick detail about how it was run. So in 2001, we saw a redistricting process run by the state legislature that kept the existing Democrats and Republicans in office. It was not an extreme racial gerrymander. It was not an extreme partisan gerrymander. It was an agreement between those in power to keep themselves in power. And going back 10 years before that, I once had the opportunity to meet with lawmakers in the state legislature and met with a lawmaker who was actually in office in the 1991 redistricting. And he described for me the process where he was brought into a back room by the legislative leadership, who had a mapper there with a set of maps on a desk. And the mapper asked him, okay, tell me, which voters do you want and do you not want? Which neighborhoods do you want and not want? So that process that was rigged in favor of those already in power was what we sought to replace when we passed ballot initiatives in 2008 and 2010, creating California's Independent Citizen Redistricting Commission. We wanted to replace a process that shut out the public with a process that was supposed to put the public in the driver's seat. So to answer your question, let's talk about whether that actually happened in 2001. Did the public get put in the driver's seat? So the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, the commission that Commissioner Yee sat on, publicized their work through radio advertising, billboards, bus shelter ads. They advertised in 46 daily newspapers and 142 weekly community newspapers. The commissioners themselves did considerable outreach. Commissioners conducted 182 presentations for community members and community organizations. The commission complemented their public outreach by bringing certain groups into the commission's meetings to present educational panels to essentially teach the commission about California. They did 23 of those panels. I think the most important of those were used to discuss methods to reach various California populations, especially the hardest to reach communities that have historically been left out or locked out of redistricting. Groups invited to present to the commission on those panels included Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Asian Health Services, California Black Census and Redistricting Hub, California Native Vote Project, the Loris Huerta Foundation, Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans, and so on. The commission overall held 196 public meetings, including public meetings to solicit information from the public on communities of interest, to receive feedback on draft maps and visualizations, and to hold live line drawing sessions. California, it got messy at times because California decided that it was going to draw its district maps on a public live stream watched by all of California. So you were going to see the good and the bad in real time on your video screen. Almost half of the meetings dedicated to receiving input from communities of interest offered Spanish listening lines and had Spanish interpreters on standby for those who wish to provide their input in Spanish. For 6 of the commission's meetings, the commission provided additional language listening lines in 12 other languages and offered interpreters in those speaking those 12 languages on standby to people who wish to give their public testimony in a language other than English. One great example, I think, of how the commission tried to bring a diverse set of folks into the process is their outreach to folks who are currently incarcerated. Paper toolkits that members of the public could use to submit community of interest testimony were shipped to 190 correctional facilities around the state. Those are jails and prisons. The commission produced a video about redistricting that was played in prisons statewide. And this actually worked. Nearly 1,300 incarcerated people returned those paper community of interest forms, providing the commission with a very unique source of community of interest input. So did all the publicity and all the translation and all the open meetings actually generate the participation the commission was hoping for? You all can be the judge of that. The commission received more than almost 3,900 verbal comments, inputs, and suggestions during commission meetings. And they received over 32,000 written comments or written submissions from individuals and from groups. Those numbers provide quite a contrast, in my opinion, to California's past process, which shut out the public almost entirely, and provide quite a contrast to what we're seeing in other states around the nation right now, as Tom and as Paul have mentioned, where politicians are drawing district lines that suit them with little regard for emerging communities or new representation. So was everything perfect with this commission? No. We had feedback for the commission consistently about how to structure public input to make it more accessible and more equitable and so on. It's just really hard to make a gargantuan process like this equally accessible to folks, all folks, including folks who don't speak English as a first language, folks who have wage-earning jobs that restrict their hours of availability and so on. It's just very, very difficult. And we had fine-tuning suggestions throughout. But the commission did a very strong job, and I would argue probably better than any other state in the nation in this redistricting cycle. I want to take a second to reflect on who the commissioners actually are, the people who did this work. So this process started with 3 auditors with partisan balance employed by the state auditor's office, evaluating an initial applicant pool of more than 20,000 Californians who wanted to serve on this commission. From those 20,000 applicants, they had to get to 14 commissioners. So a whole bunch of folks were weeded out at the beginning because the California law says that there are conflict of interest criteria that disqualify applicants who are connected in some way to political parties or to politicians. We want this to be an independent process free of political influence to the best of our abilities. And then there was multiple months of application review and over 100 interviews of applicants. And ultimately, they whittled this down to a commission of 14 regular citizens of California who were well qualified, but importantly, they were not political actors, as Commissioner Yee suggested. They were regular folks who are service-minded and familiar with many of California's diverse communities. The commission, like 10 years ago, is broadly representative of California. Not exactly representative of California, and it could be more diverse, but it was broadly representative of California's diversity, reflecting the racial diversity, regional diversity, and gender diversity of the state. And importantly, it also had LGBT representation and disability representation. I personally think giving this enormous democratic responsibility to a group of this kind, regular Californians representing the diversity of our state, instead of giving it to political incumbents, is a transformational act that inspires more faith in our democracy. So if folks on the call are interested in learning more details, the commission published a final report over 220 pages that goes into great detail about their work. You can find that document on the commission's website now. A document of that kind explaining at length how and why different choices were made in the drawing of lines is just so different from what we're seeing in other states. So let's talk more about other states. How does California fall versus other states? How many commissions? This is the first thing I want to speak on. How many commissions are used around the nation? Well, it depends on whether you're talking about commissions to draw congressional lines or state legislative lines, because sometimes it's different in certain states. But basically, you can say that there's 8 to 9 states that use independent commissions for some functions. A few other states use advisory commissions of various kinds. But the majority way of drawing political districts in California, the majority way of drawing political districts around the nation is still letting politicians draw their own maps, which obviously enables them to construct their districts to keep themselves in power. That is the system used in most of America, and it's the system we replaced here in California. Not all redistricting commissions around the country are great. Some of them have some serious flaws that we saw over the course of this year. I personally think the California Commission is better structured than the rest, and I think it does a better job of outreaching to a diverse set of communities than the rest. Though as a Californian and as a staffer at California Common Cause, which was an original backer of the commission, I am obviously biased. I have to admit that. So where do we go from here? We have to use 2022 to evaluate and study the work of this commission. We hope to spend 7 or 8 months, maybe more, studying the work of this commission, speaking to stakeholders like Paul, like Tom, like others who have followed this commission every single day, to get their opinions and their feedback on how the commission model might be improved here in California. We want to celebrate what went well, and we want to continue to fine-tune what can be improved. I also think there is lots of room to improve around local redistricting. California's local redistricting is guided in part by a state law passed in 2019 called the Fair Maps Act, which brings some order and structure to local redistricting for the first time and does require some consideration of communities that could have been completely ignored in past redistricting cycles at the local level. But too often what we're seeing at the local level is city councils and county boards of supervisors and school districts drawing district lines that are meant to keep the existing politicians in power, because at the local level, consideration of incumbency and consideration of where incumbents live is not prohibited, whereas at the state level, it is prohibited. And we saw city councils and county boards of supervisors across California exploit that this year and to do what they had to in order to keep themselves in power. And they split communities of interest and denied new opportunities for representation in the process of keeping themselves in power. So there is much work to be done at the local level to continue improve redistricting, and to make the promise of independent redistricting, what I think is this really transformational choice in democracy, more real at the local level, and to replicate some of our success we've had at the state level in our cities and our counties.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on the panel today. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all 4 of you. We have a couple of questions in the chat that are pretty interesting. So Ani Advincula is asking about the fact that the end result sort of gives the Democrats an advantage and not the Republicans. Obviously, we know Republicans are a minority in the state in terms of voter registration, but if the objective is to be balanced and to have an actual result that is fair to everyone, making Republican districts more vulnerable, is that okay?
So I'll jump in here because I think among the group, I'm probably the most political one. But first off, and Jonathan and Tom can nod their heads in agreement, maybe. These are not the lines that would have been drawn if the legislature could draw the lines. I mean, if the legislature was trying to draw lines to maximize partisan advantage, they would have drawn, in the congressional plan, they could have easily drawn Republicans into 4 or 5 seats in total that they would have the ability to get elected in. And that's not what happened. In fact, if somebody were to step, like if a Martian landed on Earth and said, well, what happened in your redistricting? And I said, well, the commission drew the commission had to eliminate 1 seat, and that 1 seat was a Democratic seat. That doesn't look like the kind of redistricting that Democrats would have drawn themselves. When you look at metrics, there were 45 seats that Biden won in the 2020 election cycle. And in the current lines, there are still 40 seats that Biden won in the 2020 elections. So there are always going to be some range of potential outcomes for partisan, the people looking at the partisan considerations. But the fact is that this commission, they didn't know where incumbents lived. In one congressional district, there are 4 Democratic incumbents living in one congressional district. In the state legislative districts right now, they're having all kinds of fights. They actually had a pillow fight in one district to determine who would win, who would be able to run in what district. You're having incumbents that are having to move and all this kind of stuff, try to hold on to their seats. So the commission definitely wasn't thinking about incumbents, and they definitely weren't thinking about partisan outcomes. We do see states that are trying to rig kind of the partisan outcomes of the elections, either through the legislatures drawing their own lines or through commissions that are essentially partisan actors, or they are, kind of independent in name only commissions. And in those states, we are seeing partisan outcomes that you can really attribute to the intention of those commissions. But there definitely was no intention of the commission. They didn't even have the tools to analyze districts to try to get at partisan outcomes. So
anyone else in the panel wants to jump in? Yes, go ahead. Meta Stein.
Tom, were you looking to jump in? You can feel free to go first.
Or Tom, I can't see you for some reason.
I'll just note very quickly that recognizing and honoring diversity does not necessarily mean advantaging Democrats. There are all sorts of communities of color and immigrant communities who don't reliably vote for Democrats. I've spent 4 years working on voting rights and census work at Asian Law Caucus, a civil rights organization, and we worked on behalf of the voting rights of some Asian American communities that in older generations pretty consistently vote for conservatives. And I think that recognizing the diversity of our state and giving communities of color and immigrant communities the opportunity to speak with one voice leads to a wide range of political outcomes. It does not necessarily advantage Democrats. And I think that's a really important consideration to recognize.
Tom?
I just want to add, what you see in the perceived Democratic advantage is a reflection of the state. And in particular with respect to the Latino community, it's a reflection that unfortunately the California Republican Party beginning 25 years ago has thoroughly alienated the Latino community. Now it's been 25 years, that's a generation, so the effects of the Pete Wilson phenomenon may be diminishing. Unfortunately for the Republican Party, Donald Trump has rejuvenated some of that nationwide. But that said, it's conceivable that the Latino community could begin to shift part of its allegiance. And that is because the Democratic Party, in my view, takes for granted the support of the Latino community nationwide and in California. But the perceived Democratic advantage is a result of those phenomena. The party affiliation of the state as a whole has shifted strongly against Republicans. And second, the largest growing population in California, Latinos, have been thoroughly alienated by that party for 25 plus years. That could change, as I said. The last thing I'll say in respect to this is one reform that I think has to be looked at for the commission, and no offense to Commissioner Yee, who did a great job, but under the current structure, Republicans are guaranteed 5 seats, even when they are outnumbered by independent voters. And that really should change. The independent voters cannot get 5 seats instead of 4 simply because they're not a party. And that should change if we continue to see independent voters in California outnumber Republicans. Otherwise, we don't have a commission that really reflects the partisan dimensions of the state of California. And the second thing I wanted to say is voting rights issues that I've focused on and that many of us have focused on are not partisan. And I will emphasize that by pointing out what's going on in other states. We just finished a trial in Illinois a democratically controlled legislature, a Democratic governor, and we challenged them because they violated the Voting Rights Act in many, many respects. They dismantled existing Latino majority districts, and they failed to create more Latino majority districts, even though Illinois, like California, saw tremendous growth in the Latino community and actually saw a significant reduction in the non-Latino population in the state of Illinois. By the same token, the state of Texas, Republican legislature and governor have once again engaged, in our view, in widespread violations of the Voting Rights Act. So we're in litigation there as well. And finally, I'll say it's commissions themselves are not perfect either. Did very well here in California, but we are looking currently at what a Washington State Commission did, where it created a majority Latino district, but that appears not to actually perform. Commissioner Yee talked about creating districts in the Central Valley that would actually perform by allowing Latino voters to elect candidates of their choice. In Washington State, the commission appears to have created a legislative district that is technically Latino majority, just above 50%, but really does not perform to allow Latino voters to elect candidates of choice. So the issues we're talking about are not partisan in nature, and what the Voting Rights Act dictates, it does not have anything to do with partisan affiliation or how folks vote. It does have those repercussions if a party has managed to alienate voters of a particularly large and growing minority group like Latinos in California.
A question for all of you. We have established that Latino representation will most likely be better or improved by these maps. Also, I think Paul mentioned Asians, but can you all talk about, ethnic groups in terms of who wins, who loses here? And including Native Americans, please. Anyone?
One thing we can say about Native Americans, is that we did make a very conscious effort consistently to try to respect Native tribal territories in California, not split them, and except in those cases where they themselves asked us to split them, a couple of instances of that. But of course, it is about numbers, and California's just got almost 40 million people, and so groups that are relatively small, they will need to be part of a coalition or other ways of aggregating political power, because you need to be a pretty big group in California to be able to constitute a majority of a voting district, even an assembly district. So,
anyone else wants to chime in?
I just would like to add that it's kind of impossible to say, like, how did minority groups benefit without saying how did Californians benefit? The plurality of the majority of the state's population is minority groups. So you can't have a redistricting that benefited minorities to the detriment of California, because California is largely minorities. There were some concerns early on in the line drawing process. As an example, in the very first iteration of these visualizations the commission did and the first drafts they put out, in some cases maybe didn't create effective districts for the two districts that are the historical Black districts in LA County. In the end, I think the lines that they developed, the Black Redistricting Hub, were supportive of. They also in Northern California have traditionally had a district that allowed for the Black community to elect a candidate of choice around kind of the Oakland area. Now there's a second district bridging Richmond to Vallejo that does also reach about a 20% citizen voting age population, Black population, to enhance the ability of that community to elect a candidate of choice or to have better representation in those areas. And a lot of the groups that were involved in this redistricting process, Black Redistricting Hub being one of them, and one of the most impactful, also the Dolores Huerta Foundation in the Central Valley. We talked about the Asian community, but Asian Americans Advancing Justice and the work that they did to really help shape the lines in a number of areas was extremely impactful. And I just don't like kind of like the black and white, how did minorities improve versus like, how did Californians improve? Just because the fact is that that is what California is now.
You're absolutely right, Paul.
So I would just add, Pilar, that there were efforts to create unity maps among the three major minority communities in California. And while there ultimately was not a single unity map submitted, those conversations, I think, resulted in all of the groups putting forward maps that were as respectful as possible of the interests of other communities. But the fact is, as Commissioner Yee said, it's a numbers game. So Latinos are large and growing. So they gained a lot from this redistricting round. Asian American community is growing and growing rapidly, more rapidly than the Latino community, but it is still a relatively, in comparison, small community. It is reaching the point where Asian American majority districts can be drawn, and we'll see more of that, I think, in future redistricting rounds. The Black community, unfortunately, is not really growing in the state of California. It's important to note that in comparison to the rest of the nation, California has a relatively small Black population, about 7%, 8% of the state. And that means that, as Paul talked about, there are existing districts that you try to protect as much as you can to present opportunities, but over time, we are probably going to see, as we've seen in prior decades, a reduction in the number of candidates who are elected with the overwhelming or strong primary support of the Black community. That's a reflection of the population of the state of California. But I think those unity mapping efforts paid off, even if we didn't end up with anything that was labeled a unity map before the commission.
If you can, panelists, please, let's stay a couple of minutes to answer a couple more questions. There's a lot of interest in the chat about the incarcerated and what the fact that the commission actually quizzed them or gave them the opportunity to say something. So, Commissioner, what can you tell us about that if you can't tell us anything?
Sure. Well, first I should mention that, for the first time, this commission actually did take those who are incarcerated in state institutions and reallocated them to their last known addresses. So that's a first for California, and we're very proud of that. We were not able to do that for those in federal institutions. The Federal Bureau of Prisons was not forthcoming with last known address information. So we were faced with a choice of whether to count them in their places of incarceration or to not count them. And we had a very spirited debate about that, which is the greater harm, so-called prison gerrymandering or just not being counted. And in the end, we decided actually not to count them. But hopefully we can change that for the next commission. In terms of inputs, a lot of it was just people happy to tell somebody about their home, their hometowns, and it wasn't necessarily actionable redistricting information. When you're in prison, you don't have internet access, and so you're kind of cut off from a lot of news and things like that. But just so happy to have people engaged at all, and most of these folks are going to be back out, in their communities someday. And to be civically engaged is certainly a positive thing. It's a positive factor for reducing recidivism and just for, being a successful citizen when they get out. So not necessarily clear themes in terms of redistricting, but just happy that people had an opportunity to tell us about their hometowns and things they cared about and getting them civically engaged.
And Pilar, I'd just like to add that the commission made the right choice to reallocate where it could. But that was a choice that California was able to make because the Census Bureau has not gone where it should in reallocating on its own all of the imprisoned populations that it counts nationwide. And that's one reform that we need to work toward across the country, convince the Census Bureau to do that reallocation. The commission had to use data from state prison operators but to have the Bureau do that in the data that it releases.
Okay, so let's just close. Yes, go ahead, please.
I just want to just very quickly credit the Black Census and Redistricting Hub and organizations in the Black community that they worked with for promoting that idea of reaching out to incarcerated populations. And it was oftentimes the commission was willing to hear good ideas from organizations following the process and act on them. And I think it's a credit to all involved.
Okay, for everyone, just a last question for everyone, because we know this, just like the census, redistricting is hard to translate literally and figuratively for our ethnic media to really be able to cover it adequately. But the impact on representation is huge. So what can you all tell us? What stories or what should we keep our eye on as the time passes from now until the next 10 years, until the next census, so people in our communities can understand why this is important? Paul?
Well, I mean, obviously, after redistricting, we start going into elections. And it's maybe hard to measure perfectly, but really we should be looking at, in particular, these areas where we've created additional districts with kind of opportunities for Latino, Asian, or Black communities, or even some of these smaller communities, whether it's Chaldeans or Armenians, whether or not you're seeing elections where those elected representatives are really reaching out to, working harder to earn the votes of those communities. And when they get elected, whether or not they're responding to those needs of those communities. Because the commission did a really good job of kind of identifying these groups, a lot of which are ethnic language minorities, but also the LGBTQ groups, the environmentalists, and other issue area groups and advocacy groups. And the test in elections is, when they're campaigning, are they trying to earn those votes? When they're representing an elected office, are they responsive to those individuals? Because that's ultimately what the framework of districts is trying to establish, is that kind of culture in our elections and our political representation that is responsive to those communities.
Thank you, as always, Paul. Commissioner?
Yeah, two things quickly. One is, I guess we need to get out some stories about how community input actually did influence us, all the time and throughout the process. And people calling in, not just the big statewide organizations, but ordinary citizens calling in with their stories, absolutely had an influence on us, absolutely did affect how lines got drawn. And so to get those stories out to help people realize that matters. The other thing is, it all depends on the census numbers, what everyone says. So when the 2030 census comes along, to really really push a great and full count, we worked with a lot of census people in the preparation for our work, and the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it really amazed us, and we're really humbled by what went into that. And those numbers absolutely are what we had to use. And so everything came down to those numbers, and it was not a perfect census. No census is, but to be counted as fully as possible is absolutely where it starts. And so we need to give all effort to that we can.
Tom?
Anything that happens only once every 10 years, whether that's the census or redistricting, it's always going to be difficult to get people focused on it. It always takes a new effort every decade to remind folks who were around and cognizant of what was going on the decade before that it's happening again. And you always have a whole new cohort of folks who have turned 18 or become more aware of what's going on politically in the intervening decades. So I don't think there's ultimately a solution to keeping this top of mind. But I think I would echo what others have said, which is look to what's happening at the local level. As Paul pointed out, we have many more localities in California as a result of conversions to district elections under the California Voting Rights Act that are redistricting this time around that didn't do so 10 years ago. And while we're unlikely, no guarantees, but we're unlikely to see litigation against the state maps, I think we will see litigation against the county and local maps throughout the state, and that will continue throughout the decade. And that litigation is an opportunity for the media to keep voters focused on the redistricting process and thinking about the 2030 census and the 2030 statewide process. There will be more litigation simply because there are so many more jurisdictions that are having to redraw their lines this time around. All of this became very concentrated because of the 4-month delay in release of the census data, which means we're going to see litigation that extends further into the decade than we might have seen in prior years. So I can virtually guarantee there will be litigation at least against one or more counties for their Board of Supervisors redistricting, and there's likely to be litigation around city and school board and community college board redistricting in one or more places around the state of California, a way to keep this top of mind for folks.
Thank you, Tom. Jonathan?
Yeah, I'll just build on Tom's point and note that local redistricting is not done yet in some places. So all of our counties completed their redistricting by mid-December, and a number of larger cities, medium-sized and larger cities, completed their redistricting by mid-December. But there are a large number of California cities that have a deadline for their redistricting process of April 17th of 2022. So local community members, this is cities that do not use the June primary election. The cities that for whom their next election is the November 2022 general election, their redistricting deadline is April 17th of next year. What that means is that there are still lots of local communities that are holding meetings to hear community of interest testimony, to hear resident input on what district mind should look like. And importantly, I want to say resident input, not citizen input. Everyone has a voice in the redistricting process. You do not need to be a U.S. citizen in order to participate. But at the local level, sometimes the barriers and the hurdles are higher. There is less likely to be translation. There's less likely to be meetings scheduled at accessible times. You're more likely to see meetings scheduled in the middle of the day when people are working and read in English only. So the local level can be harder to engage on, but in many ways, it's just as important or more important than the state process because it determines who has power and representation at the local level where issues meet the needs or don't meet the needs of families on the ground. And so I would encourage folks to use the next several months to invest themselves, to learn from this statewide process and to invest themselves in local processes where they're still going on.
Thank you, everyone. Sandy, you wanted to close?
I just want to say a huge thanks for this extraordinarily enlightening session, and a special thanks to the California Redistricting Commission for singling out ethnic media as part of the local investment in local journalism. There was a special effort to run an ad campaign for ethnic media by the commission and to support our briefings, which have brought us access to such a great group of experts. So thank you so much, the four of you. And I think redistricting is now not a foreign term, not an abstraction. You've helped make it so real, so tangible. Thank you very, very much.
Happy New Year, everyone.